What's up, Kings fans? Welcome back to In the Pipeline, presented by SoCalGas. I am your host, Jablonski, and alongside me, as always, is the Mayor, John Hoven. SoCalGas reminds you to call 811 2 days before you dig. John, as always, great being with you.
Yeah, looking forward to today's episode.
Well, in episode 1, you and I covered the goaltending prospects in the Kings organization that have a great future ahead of them. Episode 2, we moved up to the blue line, covering a trio of left-handed defensemen. And now we move to part 1 of 2, covering some of the forwards within the Kings prospect pool. And we're going to start with the trio of forwards today in Liam Greentree, Ryan Conmy, and then, of course, Cohen Zemer. Now, we'll start with Liam Greentree, the 2024 first-round draft pick for the Kings this past offseason. And, of course, the Kings have to be excited with what they have seen this year so far.
Well, I would say so far, things could not have gone any better. I think if the Kings management group got together over the summer and sort of scripted out what year one of him being in the organization was going to look like, these would exceed those expectations, what he's been able to do. You know, near leading the OHL in scoring. But for him, I think it really goes back to the summer. Mm-hmm. You know, if you think about when a player is drafted, at that point, it's the scouts that have the book on that player. They're the ones that have been out on the road and watching that player. But when you come to development camp and then you come to rookie camp, now other people in the organization, Mike Donnelly, the development coaches, et cetera, start to build their own book. And one of the things that they were all talking about after development camp was what a student this guy is and how you only really have to teach him something one time. They teach it, he goes out and he applies it, and that has allowed his development to maybe accelerate back to the point of he's ahead of the curve at this point from where you would expect him to be less than 1 year after being selected in the first round.
You mentioned Greentree being atop of the OHL in scoring. He's third right now in that category. He's right on the cusp of 100 points. But it's interesting that you mentioned perfect start, right? And you talked about the development part of his game and being a student. And it's really interesting because one of the things that I learned from him in talking to him just a few weeks ago was how much they wanted to focus on his defensive game too. And being a student and someone who has an active stick, committing to that side. And that's something that he's really taken a lot of pride in this year as well.
Yeah, you know, if this was baseball, we would be talking about he's a 5-tool player. Mm-hmm. He brings a lot to the table. And so while he already has a lot of attributes that the organization likes and wants and needs, there are other areas, like anybody that's drafted, whether you go in the first round or the 7th round, there are things to work on within your game. You know, I just look at his size. I always sort of start there when it comes to Greentree. He's big without being strong. So there's a lot more still to work on, whether it's the defensive part, whether it's training like a pro, adding sort of the muscle the right way. There really is a lot to work there. One interesting thing in watching his game as well, Jack, is elite players have the ability to slow the game down. And he slows the game down, but I'm not sure how much he's going to be able to do that once you get to the next level. And so that's, again, something else he's going to have to learn, right? When to slow the game down. Just because you can do it doesn't mean that you always want to do it. And when he gets around other elite players, it's going to be interesting to watch how his game adjusts and the pace of his game. And also when I look ahead to next year and the potential for him playing for Team Canada perhaps at the World Juniors, that pace of play is something that'll come into the conversation.
When you talk about that pace of play, one of the big attributes that he has that not everyone does is his size. And you mentioned big but not strong. 6'3", 216 with room to grow. So that's something he's got an advantage on, of course, against some of his peers. But for him, it's not just the on-ice attributes, right? He is someone who has been defined by his coach in Windsor as a leader off the ice, leads by example.
Very young captain there in
Windsor.
Very
great point. And he's someone that wants to leave a legacy. He's been challenged to leave a legacy. And for him, with 100 points and third in the OHL, he's definitely on that track.
Building off that just a little bit, it's interesting when a player is playing on a better team compared to where they were in the past. He was arguably the best player on a bad team leading into his draft year, where this year, Windsor's a much different team. They're going to make the playoffs. They're, challenging for a top spot within the standings, although London will run away with everything typically like we talked about in our last episode. But the point is, when you're on a better team, you have different opportunities. And one of those opportunities for him is to be more consistent, not just game to game, but shift to shift as well. Mm-hmm. When you're the best player on a bad team, sometimes you try to do too much. You try to take on too much. And this is allowing him to sort of grow within the attributes that are important to him and his specific game. So it's a different Liam Greentree this year than what we've maybe seen in the past. And again, I come back to development camp and I come back to learning and applying those learnings. You think about the 3 games that are played during the rookie tournament, the NHL Rookie Face-Off. game 1 to game 2 to game 3, he is a player who he elevated his game 1 to game 2. He elevated his game from game 2 to game 3. And why was he able to do that? He took the experience, he took the feedback that he was getting from the coaching staff, and then able to adjust on the fly. And so I think that's only going to help him as we look forward to where he could potentially be playing. Next year, he doesn't have the opportunity to play in the AHL because of his age. We won't get into the rules. We talked about that on the last episode. But it's either NHL for him next year or it's going to be back to the OHL. Most likely, it's probably not going to be in the NHL. I think that, I don't want to say that and declare that today. There's a lot of time left. But he's going to probably most likely go back for one more year to the OHL rather than play in the NHL. And I think we're just scratching the surface of starting to see Liam Greentree, and if the draft was again, he's not a number 26. He's going to be further up that board in a redraft just because of, like I said at the top, everything has sort of fallen into place almost too perfectly.
Yeah, there's two things there that that really stood out in what you said, and I think you first touched on being 26th in the draft. Of course, he moved up. I think I saw something in The Athletic or TSN that had him ranked as the 8th or 9th best prospect not in the NHL across the last 3 years of any draft. So, of course, a testament to Mark Yannetti and the rest of the scouting staff. And the last thing on Greentree for me is you talked about taking feedback and improving. And when I talked to Greg Walters, his head coach in Windsor, he talked a little bit about some of the similarities that he and Steven Stamkos had. Now, Walters coached Stamkos in the OHL years back when Stammer was, of course, not in the NHL. And, of course, two different players. But what they do off the ice, how they prepare, how they want to learn, how they want feedback from the coach, being able to learn from his mistakes or his previous shifts, that's something that he really saw consistency in between both Stamkos and Greentree.
Anytime that you can be a solid student, you're going to earn the trust and respect of the coaching staff, and then your teammates are going to see what you're doing as well, and that sort of elevates the rest of them because they're following you, and that's the sign of a true leader. Like we talked about, the organization saw that in him at a very young age and made him, I believe, the youngest captain in the OHL at the time when he was given the C.
So we're going to move to Ryan Conmy now, and he's a student at University of New Hampshire, a sophomore, someone who you kind of mentioned being the best player on not the best team. Conmy, for multiple different reasons, falls into that category. He's leading his team in goals and points for the second straight year, did it as a freshman and a sophomore, and now we've got a guy that has definitely exceeded where he was drafted in the 6th round.
Yeah, as we near the end of the college hockey season, it's going to be very interesting to see because UNH is a bubble team right now. They could make the final cut of 16, or perhaps they don't make that final cut. You would certainly hope that they do when you're talking about Conmy, because that would be great experience for him to go into the playoffs and to play in those big pressure moments. He certainly is the best player on that UNH team, though, and so many different attributes that we can talk about. He's improved from where he was a year ago. He might not be the biggest player, so I don't want to say he's a small player. Listed at 5'10", I don't, okay. He plays wide, so I think he's deceptive in what his size is, and he takes a lot of guys by surprise.
Yeah, you talk about playing wide and being undersized, so to speak. For him, it's interesting. In talking to his head coach, Mike Souza, he talked about how they're trying to teach him to not be as aggressive in certain situations, not taking the unnecessary hit. A lot like a quarterback getting rid of the ball before taking that extra contact. And for him, that growth from year 1 to year 2, of course, led the team in goals and points as a freshman, doing it again this year. He's already surpassed his career high in goals. He's up to 15 on the year. For him, it's not just about scoring. And him as a competitive player, it goes back to when he was a kid with his younger brother and always wanting to win. I can obviously relate to that as having a brother myself. So where the competitiveness comes from and the want to get better, the want to be the best version of himself. It's the defensive end. It's playing on the penalty kill this year a little bit as well. It's being trusted in that defensive zone. And it's something that you saw as you saw him live just recently.
Yeah, there's a couple things that you just said there to dig in a little deeper and dissect out. One is, hey, good luck trying to get the compete level out of him to get him to focus on taking maybe less hits. This guy is a magnet towards the puck. And so when you do watch him live, and a live viewing is always different than watching highlights or seeing somebody, watching a game on TV, because there you're at the mercy of the camera. Where when you go to watch a player live and scout live, you can actually focus on that guy away from the puck as well as when he has the puck on his stick, for example. There's just something about him. His nose is always involved in the action. from a goal scoring standpoint, what's so impressive to me is this year he's playing with an injury. Now, it's an injury that you can play through, but it's an injury that affects him every single day. It affects him when he's at practice. It affects him when he's in the game. The fact that he hasn't shut it down and tried to, really let that injury heal and he's played through it is a testament to see the fact that he's still putting up numbers. And Jack, what's probably the most impressive, he doesn't do it on the power play. Of those 15 goals, which are already a career high, only 2 of them have come on the power play. So he's finding other ways to, from a balance perspective, be involved, get those pucks, get them to his teammates, and then also produce offense and not doing it in the easier sort of, with the man advantage situations.
Yeah, that drive, not shutting it down. Of course, when you've got an injury that lingers and looms, you have to make that decision. Do you want to pack it up and just call it for next season? And that's not the type of guy he is, right? He's a total competitor, someone that a guy that you would probably define as a rink rat, just never gets off the ice.
Rock, paper, scissors might turn into a fist fight with that
guy.
Yeah,
it does. And that's a great play.
Ultra
it's
competitive.
Total compliment. The guy wants to improve. The guy wants to get better. His coach talked about how he's not only a leader on the ice and in his demeanor, but off the ice. Being a guy that showed up this past offseason as the best player on the ice. But then guess what? He started this year and won every competition when it came to off-ice testing.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting because he's the type of player, and they're very rare, but he's the type of player that after 2 years of college, an organization would start to look at, do we want to sign this player and bring him out a year early? Unfortunately, timing-wise, there are some guys that are probably a little bit ahead of him, and you can't sign or bring 10 guys over from Europe and put them all in the AHL. So they do have a number of players that are in front of him, but he's going to be in the conversation. He might not ultimately get that contract after the sophomore year. It might take one more year of college, and that could be okay too from an age distribution standpoint. It's not the end of the world. It's not like they're wasting a year of his development. He's still going to continue to develop there at UNH and
lots of ice time,
get lots of ice time.
Yeah.
And he has a coach that believes in him and trusts him. That says a lot as well. So anytime you're in a good situation, which he is for his development, that's great. And we'll have to see where it ultimately, how it plays itself out here over the next couple of months. And some of that could come down to, like we talked about earlier, does UNH end up making the playoffs, and how does that change sort of the trajectory of where he goes from here?
We'll transition to our third prospect, and you mentioned the injury that Conmy is dealing with, and that's been lingering throughout the season. Our third and final prospect in Cohen Zemer, he's also one that has unfortunately dealt with the injury bug. Now, Zemer, who the Kings drafted in 2023, had an extremely promising start, gets an entry-level contract after a great training camp, and then goes back to the Dub and has an ankle injury that keeps him out almost all year. He plays only 23 games last year, and now as he's finally gotten healthy this season, the Kings have a guy that is extremely promising if he's able to put all these really unique assets together.
I want to build off of one thing that you said right there, because if I don't do it now, I might forget later when we're talking. And I think it's a really important point about how much the organization likes this player. He's unique. He's different. There's nobody else like him. He has the potential to be a power forward. And so when you look over the prospect pool, there's not another power forward like him at this moment. And why do I bring this up? Because you talked about the contract. Not a lot of guys get an entry-level contract just a few months after they're drafted when they're a third-round pick. If you're a first-round pick, okay, maybe that ends up happening, right? Maybe if you're a second-round pick. But we've seen in the past, and just in the past couple of years, the Kings draft a guy in the second round, and he doesn't get an entry-level contract for 2 years. We're talking about a junior player, of course, because if you're in college, it's a different situation. But I think about Frankie Pinelli, who he was almost he was late into his second year when he received a contract. We're talking about a few months after Cohen was drafted. He goes to development camp in July. He comes to rookie camp in September. And then by November, he ends up getting an entry-level contract. So it just speaks to how much the organization really was impressed during that time period. And it's also interesting because you fast forward a year later, and it's almost like some people have forgotten about that because he missed so much time. And the injury couldn't have happened at a worse time. It came just a few weeks before the World Junior training camp, going into the World Juniors that year, which he wasn't able to participate in. So it ended his hope and his dreams for the World Juniors. It ended his hopes and plans for the rest of that season. And then you fast forward to this past summer, and I look to Michael Handzus as a great example. I remember when the Kings signed Handzus, and he's coming off ACL injury, and there was talk of, look, it's going to take this player almost a full year to get back to where he once was. And it did. And it's remarkable how, you see a dip and then you see it come back. That first year back after a major injury, is a real challenge. And that's what I think Zemer's going through. He didn't have the best development camp. He didn't have the best rookie camp. It doesn't mean that he had a bad one. It just means he was at such a high level his first camps that when you come back the following season, even with an injury, people are expecting to see the same player. You're not going to. This is a player coming off a significant ankle injury. But he slowly is working his way back into getting that. We're seeing glimpses of it. The consistency is not quite there. But that's one of the reasons I think next year is going to be so significant in his development, is that you're now going to have the opportunity to see the full Cohen Zemer back, which, we get glimpses of right now.
Yeah, absolutely. A few things there that really stuck out is the assets, right? You talked about being a power forward. He's only 6'1", but he's a thick 6'1" at 205 pounds.
It's just sort of distributed the wrong way, as I think how scouts would say at this particular time, right?
Yeah, it's different, but he's a guy that has a ton of offensive ability. He leads his team in goals with 32 right now. But on top of that, he's also not getting all the opportunities. So he's got to work his way back. He was on a first line last year. He's playing first, second line this year. So like you said, it's going to take time, but his ability to contribute on the offensive end, to be a guy that disrupts play, who's hard to play against as a forward, he's a guy that defensemen are going to hate playing against.
This is where those viewings are so important. And this is where scouts earn their money, right? It's really easy for one of us to sit back and look up on a laptop and go, oh, well, he has X number of goals or Y number of assists or his plus minus. Even if you dig into some of the fancy stats and you look at those things, that's the easier part.
Yeah.
But actually watching a player like this is when you get excited and you go, oh, he's special. He's unique. He does things that other players don't do. And again, that's why I think he's going to be such a significant, person in the organization. The real question is going to be next year. So let's take a quick step back. This year, heading into camp, he was a unique player because of where his birthday fell and everything else. Again, I won't get into the rules, but he had the opportunity to go back to the WHL. He could have played in the AHL, or of course he could have played in the NHL. So why did he go back to the WHL? And it has to do, quite honestly, with fitness. It has to do with conditioning, things that he didn't get an opportunity to work on last year. But I go back even further, go back to the draft, and Mark Yannetti at the draft there in Nashville, when they took him in the third round, was talking about, hey, here's a player who didn't score very well among the 100 plus players that came to the combine. Matt Price wasn't particularly impressed. That's why I say the whole thing about it's 200 pounds distributed in the wrong areas. That's not a knock on the player. We have to remember he's a kid, and kids, they're training. And then there's a whole other level about training when you're training as a pro. And that's where making it to the AHL is such a significant step for these players. And that's why next year is really the year I'm looking at for this particular player. Because whether you're talking about the compete level, whether you're talking about consistency, whatever it is, development coaches have a way of making players better in those particular areas, taking raw skill and then turning them into more complete players. And so I expect that next year he's going to turn into that more complete player for two reasons. One, he's another year away from the injury recovery, if you want to call it that, and then also having the ability to work on a day-to-day basis with the development coaches. You're going to see him not just take one step. I think you're going to see him take 3 or 4 steps next year.
You talked about conditioning and consistency. I think those are two attributes that are going to play a vital role in how much success Cohen Zemer has at the next level, or just in his hockey career in general, because we have skill. You have a unique path that not a lot of players in this organization have around him. So no question there's an opportunity. Will he be able to take advantage of it? That's the big question.
That's also why I wanted to get out from the very beginning the part about signing him. It's such an important point to this whole story, because I think some people might want to walk away from a conversation when we're pointing out things that players still need to work on, and some of the shine might come off of those prospects, which is why I always circle back to that. The organization signed this player just a few months.
There's a reason.
There's a reason why. And it goes back to the viewings. It comes back to when you watch this kid, you get excited. There's a lot to work with there. And sometimes it's not a completely upward line. Sometimes there are some bumps in the road, and his injury was a bump in the road, right? And then you have to watch the comeback from that injury and how that happens, and there are ups and downs. But make no mistake about it, though. If you were to really dig in and look at the segments of what this kid's been able to do, he had stretches where he was on beyond a heater this season. So it's not like he's been in a slump since coming back from the injury. It's just it's sometimes we compare it to what we first saw at development camp or at training camp, where he was off the charts, head and shoulders above everybody else. Well, he was 100% healthy too. So let's give him an opportunity. Let's give him a chance to get back there. Having that contract, again, just speaks to how much those in the organization, not only the scouts like Mark Yannetti and his team, but also over on the development side and all the way up to the general manager, how much they really like this player.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for In the Pipeline presented by SoCalGas. We'll see you next time for part 2, where we've got 3 more forwards to talk about. SoCalGas reminds you to call 811 2 days before you dig.
In the Pipeline is presented by SoCalGas. SoCalGas reminds us to call 811 2 days before digging.